Hello, boys and girls. It's good to see you again. I've got another story for you tonight, and this is one that I think a lot of boys are going to like. Girls like it too, but especially boys, because it's about two little boys. And these two little boys, their names are, let me get that right, their names are Peewee and Elmo. And Peewee is not the Peewee you've seen on television with Pee-wee's Playhouse, and Elmo is not the Elmo on Sesame Street. These are two little best friends. Pee-wee's called Pee-wee because when he was born he was very, very little, and the nurses named him Pee-wee because he was in the hospital for a while he was so little. And Elmo was named after his grandpa, who was named Elmo, so that's how come he got his name. So this is a story about two best friends and the mischief that they used to get into when they were little. And this is probably the scariest thing that they ever did, according to them. They lived out in the suburbs. That means just outside of a city, and they lived in a nice neighborhood, but they lived next door to each other, and they were about the same age. When they first got together, they were very little, and then they started doing their adventures about when they were 8 and 9 years old. But in this adventure, they're about 10 and 11 years old. Pee-wee's the brains of the bunch, and Elmo's the one that carries out the stuff that Pee-wee tells him to do. So Elmo does a lot of the dirty work in these adventures they go on. So this is a story about when Pee-wee and Elmo decided to go camping and what happened to them. So they live near big cities, so they're not used to being out in the country. And they decided that they wanted to go out in the country to have a good adventure, and they wanted to go camping because they'd never been camping. And they'd read some about it and known some people that, or some of their friends, I guess, had been in a Boy Scout group or something at their church, and they went camping, and they really enjoyed it. And so Pee-wee and Elmo decided they wanted to do it, but they were going to do it on their own. They weren't going to join the Boy Scouts. They were just going to go camping on their own. Well, like mischievous little boys do, which don't you do this, but don't you do what Pee-wee and Elmo does. But Pee-wee and Elmo decided that they were going to catch them a ride, and they were going to go to Tennessee and do their camping in a big national park there in Tennessee. And the name of the big national park is Big South Fork National Recreation Area. And they were going to go camping there because they'd heard a little bit about it and read about it, and decided that that would be a perfect place for them to go. So they packed up their stuff one day. They got together. They got their little red wagons that they had in their garage, and they put their stuff in it, and they were walking down the road. They were going to try to walk to Tennessee. But Tennessee's a long ways from where they lived. So they started getting tired about the end of the day, and they decided to get them something to eat because they'd emptied their piggy banks and had put all the money that they had in their piggy banks in their pocket so that they could get them something to eat if they got hungry on the trip. So anyway, when they stopped at the mini market, there was a whole bunch of motorcycles there. So they decided to go in and get them a candy bar and a soda pop and find out who was riding all those motorcycles. So they went in, and they saw all these guys dressed up like rough guys, like a motorcycle gang. And they decided, that is a motorcycle gang. So Pee-wee decided to talk to one of them and found out that they were going to a convention in Tennessee, not far from where that Pee-wee and Elmo had decided to go camping. So he talked to the guy and told him that some big story about getting lost and trying to find their parents and needed a ride. And so the guy was nice enough to give them a ride. So one of them got on the back of one of the motorcycles with one of the biker gang, and the other one got on the another one's motorcycle, the back of it. And so they all took off after they'd eaten their candy bars and drank their soda pop. They all took off, and they were headed to Tennessee. Well, it wasn't a very great trip because the guys were going a little bit too fast for them. Peewee and Elmo had never ridden on a motorcycle, and it kind of scared them as fast as they were going. And when they go around curves, they'd lean the motorcycle one way, and Peewee and Elmo didn't know how to not go with it. And they were afraid that if they leaned over too much, they would fall or have a wreck, and then they'd go to on another curve, and the same thing would happen. So it was kind of scary for them. And it started raining. Oh, it started raining, and then they got cold, and they got soaked and wet, and the motorcycle gang just kept going because they were trying to get to their convention at a certain time. So anyway, they rode and rode and rode, and finally they got to an area that was a highway called 154, and it split into a road called 297, and that was the number of the road. And 297 was the one that's on the way to the Big South Fork National River and Recreation National Park. So Peewee and Elmo got off where the road split, and they decided to walk the rest of the way to the national park. Well, it took them a long time, several hours, but they finally made it down there, and they decided not to go talk to the park ranger, not to let him know that they were there. They weren't going to, they didn't want to be around the other campers, so they decided to go find their own place down by the river and put up their camp so that they could have their campsite all to themselves with nobody bothering them. So they did that, and they went down there. They found a nice place just at the edge of the woods that went out where the rocks were by the river, and they set up their camp. They set up their tents. Well, actually, I should say tent, because it was a big tent, and it was just for a couple of people, so they decided to have the bigger tent and share the tent. And then they set up a little campfire. They had all their stuff ready so they could have a campfire. They gathered up a little wood and made them a little fire. They had a little bit of food. I don't know what all they carried, but they had some food with them. But anyway, so they heated up a little something and decided they were so tired that they pulled out their sleeping bags and they were going to go to sleep. Well, it had been probably an hour after they got there, after they went to bed, and they heard thunder and lightning. Now, they hadn't watched a weather forecast to see what was going to happen, if they were going to have a storm or not. But they heard the storm, and it got really big. Lightning just striking everywhere. They could hear it bang around so bad that they knew that it was hitting some trees, and it scared them really bad. And then here came the rain. The rain was so heavy that they didn't know if their tent would even hold up. And their tent was kind of getting soaked. And they figured they were going to get soaked before it was all over. So the lightning struck really close to them, struck a tree, and it set the tree on fire. Even in the rain, it burnt. And then in a little while, the rain slacked off, but the fire kept burning. And it set some more trees on fire. So it started a forest fire in the national park. And they knew they were in trouble then because the park ranger didn't tell them they could camp there, and they knew there was trouble coming. So as they were thinking about what they were going to do, the creek started rising, going up higher and higher, and it went over its banks, and it came up to the dry land where they had put their tent. And their tent started moving. And then their little wagons and everything they had that they'd held on to all during their ride with the bikers started floating away. Their food, their few little pots and pans and cups and whatever they had with them, and their whole tent with their sleeping bags in it started washing away. And the more it rained, the river rose up a little more, and their stuff just started floating away. So here they didn't have any food. So the next morning when it got daylight, and they were hungry, they didn't know what to do because they didn't have a ride back home. The motorcycle fellas was supposed to come back and get them in a few days, but they weren't coming back that day. So they decided they were going to have to rough it and find their own food. So they went out to look for food. Well, these were city boys. They weren't country boys. And they did not know what kind of plants were okay to eat. And they didn't know how to find any other food. So they walked and walked until they finally found some berries. And they didn't know what kind of berries they were. So they stood back and watched a few minutes. And some birds came down and got the berries. And so they decided that if it didn't kill a bird to eat it, that it was probably okay for them to eat. So they ate some of the berries. Then they went along a little ways and they found some nice looking plants that kind of looked like some plants they'd seen before in their own yard, but they didn't know if it was okay to eat. So they stood back a while and they watched, and there was a little animal that came up and got some of that plant and chewed on it. A little gopher, I believe, came up and looked at it. So anyway, when the gopher was chewing on it, they decided that if a gopher can chew on it, they can chew on it. So they picked them some of that, and they chewed on it, and they ate that plant. So they had some berries and a little bit of the plant that they found, but it wasn't very filling. They were still hungry. So they went on a little ways, and they got to thinking about what they were going to do when it started getting dark. And they decided they better fix them up another campsite. But they didn't have any of their equipment, so they didn't know how to fix their campsite. So anyway, they walked on down, and they walked to the edge of the river, and guess what they found? They found their sleeping bags that had washed down the river. They had got snagged on an old piece of wood that was in the water, an old tree that had fallen, and some rocks. So they got them a big old long stick, and they worked until they got that loose, and they walked in the water a little ways, and they tugged on their sleeping bag and finally got their sleeping bags out. And they put them over their shoulder, and they took them up to the edge of the water, and they walked a little ways till they could find a flat, good place that didn't look like the water would come up any higher and wash them away in the night again. So they got their sleeping bags out, and they laid them out in the sun to dry. Well, they were probably 3/4 of the way dry when it started to get dark. And Peewee and Elmo were really getting tired because they'd walked all day long, and they were very hungry. And they were kind of getting cold. So they decided it sure would be nice to get in those sleeping bags. And so they left them out there a little bit longer, and the wind started to blow, and it dried them a little bit quicker. And the sun hadn't gone down quite yet. And so the warmth from the sun did help dry them out more. Peewee said, Elmo said, I'm going to go ahead and get in my sleeping bag, and I'm just going to lay down for a while because I'm really tired. Elmo said, Peewee, I think I will too, because tomorrow's going to be a rough day. So they went to climb in their sleeping bags, and they felt something around their foot down there. They thought, what is that? Peewee said, I don't know what that is, but there's something wrapped around my foot. And Elmo said, yikes, there's something around mine too. And Peewee hollered, run, Elmo, run. And Elmo tried to get out of his sleeping bag and run. But as soon as he crawled out and looked down, he saw it. Peewee came out of his sleeping bag, and he looked down and he saw it too. They both had big snakes around their foot and around their legs. And they screamed, ah! Big and loud, so that most of the people in the whole park could have heard them. They screamed and tried to run, but it just made the snakes a little bit mad, so the snakes were snapping out like that. Luckily, since they were wrapped around the leg, they weren't going up to get them. They were just snapping outward to try to get whatever was there. So they didn't bite Peewee and Elmo. But Peewee and Elmo were plenty scared, and they ran a little while, and that snakes never did turn loose. So they decided to try to figure out how to get them off there. So Peewee hollered, Elmo, come over here. And he said, let's get us some rocks and sticks and get them off of us. So they ran over there, and there was some rocks and some sticks, and the sticks looked pretty good. So they got them, and they took the sticks and they lifted the head up, and then they hit it with a rock. And they just kept doing that, and the snake would jerk out like that. And they were so scared they were shaking, and they couldn't hardly do it. But they got the stick again, and they stuck it out like that, hit it with a rock. And they did that a few times until the snake gave up, or the snakes gave up and took off and slithered away. So they were thinking, oh my goodness, what more can happen? But anyway, they turned their sleeping bags upside down and shook them like that to make sure nothing else was in there before they got back in there. So they laid back down, and they thought, we don't have a fire tonight, so something could get in our sleeping bag again. So they wrapped them around them really good, and their heads were still out though of their sleeping bag. They didn't put their heads down in their sleeping bag because they wanted to be able to breathe good, but they were plenty worried about what might happen. Well, in the night when they went to sleep, they moved around enough that the sleeping bag loosened up. And in their sleep, they kind of twisted and turned and came out of their sleeping bag a little bit. And when they did, there was mosquitoes everywhere in that area near the water. And when they smelled the humans, Peewee and Elmo, they started in the air. They were moving around and everything. They came up that way. And of course, they smelled fresh people. And so the mosquitoes went down and got in their sleeping bags, got all over their clothes, and bit them all over. They had big welts come up on them in their sleep. When they got up the next morning, they looked at each other and said, oh my goodness, what's the matter with you? Look at you. And they looked around, and then they started itching, and they looked at each other and said, you've got big old welts all over you. That's what Peewee said to Elmo, and Elmo said, Peewee, you do too. So they were itching and scratching and moving and trying to figure it out, and they shook their sleeping bags, and all these old mosquitoes came out, and it was kind of nasty. Well, in the night, it'd been miserable. They didn't even feel like they'd slept, so they decided to try to walk out of there or find a good field if they could find one. If they didn't know if there was one or not. They walked and walked for a while, and they finally did come across a field out in there. And they looked, and they saw a deer. And they looked, and they saw a few more deer. So they thought, well, that's pretty nice. Deer are nice animals, so maybe this is a good place to stay. So they went out there, and they tromped down some of the grass and fixed them a place out there where they could camp out the next night. And they looked around to see if they could find some berries or some kind of food or that plant that they'd eaten yesterday. And they couldn't find anything today. So they decided to watch the deer, and whatever the deer ate, they were going to eat. So they watched and watched, and finally some of the deer, when it started getting toward evening time, some of the deer came out, and Peewee said, look at that, Elmo. What do you see? And Elmo said, well, they're sticking their faces up in that tree. Wonder what they're doing that for. Peewee said, I think that they're eating. So they crawled through the grass. Peewee and Elmo did, sneaked over there, so the deer couldn't see them, and they looked to see what the deer were doing. And the deer were eating apples off of a wild apple tree. So, they were excited, because they like apples. Peewee and Elmo do. And they were excited that they had found an apple tree. So they squirmed around in the grass, couldn't hardly wait to get some apples from it. And as they were squirming around, it scared the deer, and the deer ran off. So Peewee and Elmo ran and got up in the tree and climbed up in the tree, and they ate apples until their bellies hurt. They ate and ate and ate because they didn't know if they was going to get to eat again tomorrow or not. So they ate all they could possibly eat. And then they picked a few and put them in their pockets before they climbed down. Excuse me. And when they climbed down the tree, they went back to their sleeping bags, and they felt full. They had full tummies. they were kind of warm now. It was warm. Their sleeping bags weren't wet anymore. And so they were pretty excited, and they were just wanting to take them a good long sleep for the night. Well, they were still a little bit scared, though. So before they went to sleep, they decided to get them some big sticks for weapons in case something bothered them in the night. And right before the sun set, they finally went and got in their sleeping bags because they didn't want to wait till dark because then they couldn't see their sleeping bags. So they got in their sleeping bags, and they were just about to go to sleep when they heard this funny sound. And it sounded almost like a girl screaming, or it was a wild kind of scream, like a person instead of a animal. So they listened and they heard it again. And then they heard it big and loud, like a big sound like that. And it was a big scream. And they looked around, and what did they see? They saw coyotes sitting just a little ways from them, watching them. Coyotes. Now, coyotes, they're all over in Tennessee. And they're down at the big South Fork River and Recreation place, too, in the National Park. And coyotes will eat little animals, and if they're really hungry, they'll eat little children. But mostly just little animals. But they were really hungry. And right before a coyote is going to attack something to kill it, to eat, all of them together, they go and make these yappy barking scream sounds. I can't make those, but anyway, that's the kind of sound they make, almost like human, but not. So they started to do that, and Peewee and Elmo were pretty scared. So they got their sticks ready just in case they had to defend themselves. So they watched, and they didn't hardly move, and they looked around. And they waited, and they listened to see what the coyotes would do. Well, excuse me, I'm getting sleepy too. It's about my bedtime. So anyway, they listened, and in a few minutes they started noticing that the coyotes started moving a little closer and a little closer. And then they'd stop and sit down. Then if everything was quiet, Peewee and Elmo would look around like that. If everything was quiet, that the coyotes would move a little. They'd get up and move a little closer. Then they'd sit down and wait. And then they'd do that again. And the last few steps before they got to where Peewee and Elmo had made their little camp, the last few steps they didn't stop. They just kept coming, walking. And they hunkered down real low. They were going real slow. And Peewee hogged, Elmo, get your stick. And they pulled their sticks out, and they started hitting and swinging, and just like a baseball bat. And they hit and they swung at those old coyotes and screamed. They screamed and hollered and did all that at one time. So they were going, ah! And they were doing that with their big sticks. And it scared the coyotes so bad that the coyotes ran off. And so they were plenty glad of that because they were scared and they didn't want to have to deal with them. So anyway, they were thinking, what else can bother us? Is there anything else that can bother us here in this place? So they finally laid down a little while, and coyotes had run off. The mosquitoes were not out so bad since they weren't so close to the river. Now, the forest fire died down from the night before, and the snakes were gone. At least they didn't see any. If there was any close by them then, they didn't see any anymore. So they were thinking, I can't wait to get out of here. Peewee said, Elmo, said, you know what? We need to go home tomorrow. And Elmo said, we can't because the bikers are not coming back yet. He said, well, we need to find a way to get home. We folded up our little wagons when we rode with the bikers. He said, I think we need to straighten them out, unfold them, put what little stuff that we have, our sleeping bags in them, and we need to get home. We can put one knee in there and push with the other foot, and we need to go home. But Elmo said, Peewee, That's more than 100 miles away. It's probably 200 or 300 miles away. We can't do that. We'll get run over. Now, and Peewee said, well, we need to go home. What are we going to do? Elmo said, well, I remember seeing a building up there by the first camp that we had. And Peewee said, yeah, I do too. I remember seeing a building. I think that was a restroom area that they had at the park. He said, we could go up there and we could hide in there for the night and stay in there. He said, probably nobody would be in there at nighttime but us. So that's what they decided to do. So they found their way back. The next morning, when they got up, they walked and walked and found their way back to the place they had first gone to when they got to the park. And they could see all the damage that the forest fire caused. They couldn't find their tent. They looked around for it, couldn't find it. And they were pretty hungry. So they came up with a plan how to get some food. They thought if there was any picnickers out or any campers out, if the campers were fixing breakfast, that they'd walk up there and be real friendly to them and act like they were really hungry, and maybe they'd feel sorry for them because they were just little boys. Maybe they'd feel sorry for them and give them some food. So that's what they did. They smelled somebody cooking some bacon, and they like bacon. Peewee and Elmo love bacon. So anyway, they smelled it, and oh, they were so hungry. And they were so thirsty. They wanted some clean water, but they wanted some milk, because that's what they like to eat with their breakfast. So they walked up there, and they started talking to, oh, excuse me, I'm getting sleepy too. I hope you're getting sleepy. Anyway, they walked up to the campers, and they told them what a terrible time they'd had, and they were trying to find their original campsites, what they told the campers, and said they didn't have any food, and they were sure hungry. And so it was a whole family that was camping there, and the mother felt sorry for them and fixed them each a plate. So they had some breakfast. She fixed them a plate full of food for breakfast and gave them some milk, and they were so thankful for that. But they told them goodbye and said they had to move on because they had to get back to the place to where their rides were going to come and get them. The people who were going to give them a ride home were going to come and get them. But they didn't tell them that they were probably going to miss the ride because the bikers weren't coming that day. But anyway, they walked up there and they thought, when nobody's looking, we'll go in there and check out the bathroom and see how it is. Well, they watched and people kept going in and out all day long, and they never could get a chance to go in there. Oh, I'm so tired. Boys and girls, are you getting sleepy now? Anyway, they finally, when it started to get close to dark, and they were a little scared of the dark anyway, but there was a light on in the bathroom, so they went in there. They decided to bar the door so nobody else could get in, and so they could go to sleep. So they put their little sleeping bags there, and they got a big stick, and they fixed the door where nobody else could open it all through the night. So they fell asleep and slept all night long on the old hard floor, but they were in their sleeping bags. The next morning, somebody started banging on the door trying to get in because they had to use the bathroom. And Peewee and Elmo, they got up, and Peewee said, you just can't sleep anywhere. Somebody's got to bother you. And Elmo said, yeah, I know. And they said, boy, I wish the bikers would come by today and take us home. This place is just awful. Said, you got to be tough to live in Tennessee or to camp here because everything happens. Said, these people here are tough people. They got to deal with this all the time, and the weather, all that rain and wind. Glad we don't have to do that in the city. And Peewee said, well, we've had fun though, kind of. Not exactly, but kind of. Some of it was, and some of it's scary and not so good. Elmo said, I don't know if I ever want to come back. Peewee said, well, I've got a plan. He said, when we get home, we're going to start going to the gym and working out, so we'll be tough the next time if we want to come back here and camp. Because you got to be strong and tough to do that. And we've got to make some other plans on how to have food the next time and not have to eat these awful plants and berries that don't fill you up. we probably lost 15 pounds each. So anyway, they were walking along and talking about that, and they heard something. And they said, listen. Peewee said, Elmo, listen. He said, what is it? They listened for a minute. They turned their ear that way, turned their ear that way, listened. And Elmo said, Peewee, that sounds like motorcycles. And Peewee said, exactly. It sounds just like motorcycles. I think they've come back for us today. He said, let's run out there and see. So they had been walking along in the area of the restroom building. So they decided to run up there to the entrance where they'd come in earlier a few days ago. And sure enough, those bikers were there. They had come back. They had actually come back for Peewee and Elmo. Peewee and Elmo were so glad to find them, or to see them. And, oh, they were so happy. So the bikers said, how you doing, little buddies? They said, we need to get out of here. He said, this is no place for people. He said, there's everything around here. There's snakes and coyotes, and there's forest fires, and there's mosquitoes. Look at us. We're covered in red dots just because of the old mosquitoes. He said, you got to be tough to live in Tennessee, and I don't want to be here anymore. He says, I got to go home. Elmo said, yeah, me too. He said, I want to go home too. I miss my mommy. And Peewee said, yeah, I do too. I miss my mommy. I want to go home and sit in my mommy's lap and let her give me a hug and sleep in my nice clean bed. And maybe Mommy will fix us a good meal and make us some cookies. Whew. It sure will be good to be home. And the bikers said, okay, little buddies, let's get y'all folded up. Let's get those wagons folded up and all your stuff. And they said, well, we don't have all of our stuff anymore. We only got our sleeping bags. The rest of it got washed away. But here it is. So they packed it up. They hopped on the back. The bikers took them home. And they ran out and they ran. And when they got home, they ran into their mommy's arms. And were so glad to be home they couldn't stand it. And Peewee said, Elmo, I'll see you tomorrow. And Elmo said, Peewee, I'll see you tomorrow. And they each went in their own home with their mommy's arms around them, hugging them up because their mommies were going to take them in and take care of them. And boy, were they glad. And that night, Peewee and Elmo slept really good with full tummies. And, oh, they felt so much better. And they got a good night's sleep, which I hope you do, boys and girls. So try to get you some sleep, and I'm going to get some sleep too because I'm sleepy too. Have a good night.